All right. Hello and welcome tonight. Thank you so much for coming. This is our version of the U.S. Congressional Candidates Forum here at SKC, Salish Kootenai College, hosted on behalf of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. We're very proud to have this particular forum. It's the only one of its kind for the congressional candidates that's actually being held on an Indian reservation. I know at one point the candidates actually had gotten together and decided they did want to do something on a reservation, and we're very proud that they would choose our reservation. My name is Gwen Langford. I'll be the moderator for this evening. I'm actually the communications director for the Salish and Kootenai tribes as well. I'd like to introduce the candidates that we have here tonight. To my left, directly, Mr. Mike Fellows, who is a Libertarian candidate, Ms. Tracy Velazquez, who is a Democratic candidate, and Mr. Denny Rehberg, who is the incumbent Republican candidate for the U.S. Congressional District in Montana. I'd also like to introduce our panelists. Ms. Gwen, who is a member of the Crow tribe. She is a University of Montana Journalism School rising star. She's also a writer columnist for ResNet. Currently, she is also a CHIPS Quinn Scholar, which is a pretty prestigious scholarship to have. She's also worked for the Great Falls Tribune most recently. You may have seen her articles this past summer, also for the Seattle Times, and she's also published currently her column in the Bighorn County News and Native Voice. In the middle, our panelist is Bernard Azure. He is a member of the Assiniboine tribe of the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. He's a veteran journalist, currently part owner and reporter for the Valley Journal News. It's a weekly, new weekly that comes out on Wednesdays, bachelor's in journalism from the University of Montana. And also Kimberly Swaney. She's also a member of the Salish tribe of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. Currently, she serves as the publisher-editor for the Charcusta, the news of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. She also has a business administration degree from the University of Montana. I'd also like to introduce Ruth Quickwasoo, who is at the back table. She is the one who has actually helped put up a lot of the logistics for this event and has also been the one who's taking the questions from the audience that we will get to at the end of this forum. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Matt Freelander, who's going to be helping us time this evening. And also Dr. Frank Tyro, who is helping us officially tape this event. So again, I appreciate you guys all being here and participating in this. Okay, I'd like to go over the format so that we're all clear as to what the format will look like for this evening. We've just had the candidates actually draw an order that they will actually give an introductory statement. At this time, Ms. Velazquez will be first, Mr. Rehberg will be second, and Mr. Mike Fellows will be third. For those introductory statements, each candidate will have 3 minutes, and I didn't give too much introductory on my part because I would hope that they would do that themselves, so that's their opportunity to do that. Then we'll move into panelist questions. We have each panelist prepared to ask each candidate one question. At that time, the candidate who is being asked will have a 2-minute opportunity to answer the question. The other two candidates, after that particular candidate has answered, will then get 1 minute to rebut or to add their own 2 cents to the question. The order that we'll start with would be Ms. Luella Bren. And we'll just go through that as it happens. The next part of this particular forum will then be the audience questions. If you have not yet submitted a question and you would like to, please see Ms. Quickwasoo at the back, and she will be happy to take your questions. I will then actually take those questions and I will ask them of the candidates. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer each question from the audience. Concluding remarks will also be in the order that they've drawn for introductory remarks, along with the audience questions as well in terms of order. And we are going to be ending promptly at 8:30, so just so you know that. I know that there may be more audience questions than we can accommodate, but we do have scheduling in the midst of a campaign season that other candidates we need to adhere to. So with that in mind, I'd like to go ahead and give Ms. Velazquez an opportunity for her introductory remark of 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Gwen, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. I know this was a short notice debate, and I was glad to see so many people here tonight. And people often wonder, what role does a debate have in an election and in a campaign? And I think there's no more important event in a campaign than debates. Debates are your opportunity to talk to the candidates, ask them questions directly, and get some straight answers. because I think that's what makes democracy work. I am excited to be running for the United States House of Representatives. I live in Bozeman. I have a family and a small business. And I'm excited to be here at the college because as I've traveled around Montana, I've spent time on Montana's Indian reservations. I've spent time talking with tribal college representatives, people working in Indian Health Service. And I think that the issues that Montana faces are serious. And the issues that are faced among the Indian population on reservations are serious as well. And actually, I think that they're very similar. Maybe not so much well, maybe a little different in terms of scope, but when I travel around Montana, people talk to me about health care. The situation right now with underfunding for Indian Health Service is very serious. And the situation in Montana and America is very serious in terms of people without insurance, people who can't afford health care, hospitals that are in the red because they have so many uninsured people getting services there. When I travel around Montana, people talk to me about education. They talk about the problems No Child Left Behind has caused in their communities, in their schools, for their children. And the problems of Indian education are serious as well. And the fact that the president's upcoming budget will not be increasing education funds is a very serious problem. When I talk to people about jobs, we talk about good paying jobs all over Montana. Montana's Indian reservations have very high rates of unemployment. If there's one thing that can make a difference in so many different areas, it's good paying jobs with health insurance and with benefits. One of the keys, I think, to that is making sure that our representatives keep the working people of Montana in mind. That means working for fair labor laws, not cutting overtime pay. That means not giving special breaks to corporations at the expense of our workers. It means investing in our rural communities here in Montana so that we can grow jobs here. And I'd like to hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about this throughout the night, my vision for Montana. So thank you very much.
All right, Mr. Rehberg, 3 minutes, please.
Well, Gwen, let me begin by thanking you for giving us an opportunity to be on the reservation today and having this at the college. I have a great working relationship with the Salish Kootenai. Shortly after I became your congressman in 2001, I invited Tony, your cultural, spiritual leader, out to be the very first chaplain in the United States House of Representatives, the first time a Native American had actually been the chaplain. I've spent a lot of time with Fred Matt over the course of the years, and Joe, your executive secretary, has been very helpful as well. We've discussed issues everywhere from the nursing educational opportunities on the university campus to the bison range issue, water rights, the joint board, and the consensus building that has been occurring. My first chief of staff, in fact, was from St. Ignatius, a fellow by the name of Alan Mickelson. I hail from Billings, but my current chief of staff hails from Polson, and that's fairly unusual. I've had 2 chiefs of staff over the course of the 4 years, and they've both come from this area, so I have a unique working relationship with Lake County residents. When I first went back to Washington, I established a goal for myself, a mission, a vision of trying to build a more secure future for Montana families. It's the vision I wake up with every morning. I say it to myself. And it's more than just that. I developed a strategy of surrounding myself with people like you that have the same vigor and enthusiasm for understanding the issues of the day. Certainly September 11th changed a lot. Who would have understood that somebody would bring the level of terrorism to our shores that occurred on September 11th? Think of where we have come since that day. We were working into a recession. We saw the terrorism come to our shores, while at the same time we had to keep an eye on the issues domestically. And so as a result, I asked to be on the committees that I hoped would help the most vulnerable Montanans in the largest way. You can't be on every committee. By rule, you get 2 committees and 4 subcommittees. As a result, I asked for the Agricultural Committee. Why? Because agriculture is vulnerable within Montana, and it is still our #1 industry. I asked for the subcommittees on commodities, on specialty crops, and on forestry. I then, as my second committee assignment, asked for transportation. What's more important than moving ourselves around safely and our products within the state and out of the state? And so I've had an intimate knowledge and working relationship with those that are interested in Highway 93. My third committee, and I asked for an exemption and did receive it from my leadership, was to be on the Resources Committee to develop an energy policy for this nation. So you can see through my experiences of having been a lieutenant governor, my experiences of being a fifth-generation Montana rancher who has raised his family in Montana, attended public schools, that I'm trying to build that more secure future for the people of Montana through my committee assignments, the projects I work on, and building a consensus with the type of people that exist within Lake County and the other 56 counties of Montana.
All right, Mr. Fellows, 3 minutes, please.
Well, first I'd like to say thank you for inviting us here. It's always nice to come up this way. I find this area and Flathead nice places to visit. My name is Mike Fellows. I'm the Libertarian runner for the U.S. House. A Libertarian, their philosophy is simply that you live your life as you see fit, as long as you're not infringing on the rights of others to live their lives. That means you can pursue your own goals, you can pursue your own happiness, as long as you don't infringe on those others to do the same thing. I think Libertarians also want to see a smaller government. Certainly with the Bush administration's recent budget at over $1 trillion, that's not the kind of budget that I would want to vote for. I think any time you see the government get into such things as health care, it's simply risen the cost of health care dramatically. I know when we had the Medicare laws in the 60s, the lawmakers never envisioned the cost going over $15 billion. Now it's over $96 billion, and with the recent government reform, Medicare Reform Act, that cost is going to over $500 billion, and the cost of health care in this country has risen correspondingly to over 18%. That's a lot of things that we certainly can't afford. And I certainly have sympathies to getting the terrorists and the 9/11, but what is the 9/11 event showing us? It's showing us that we're going to see more laws like the Patriot Act invade our civil liberties that put us on databases. We have the 9/11 recommendations coming out now, where we may see driver's licenses that'll be unified in all 50 states. A lot of people think that's simply a national ID card. You'll need that everywhere you travel. We're going to see databases, certainly with personal information, not just the terrorists, but for all of us. And so we might all be labeled a terrorist, because if you want to make sure somebody's in a database, you want to make sure you collect information on everybody in the country. And those are the things that I really worry about. We do have a Bill of Rights, and in the H.R. 10, which is the 9/11 recommendations, they do have a civil liberties enforcement director. But we already have the Bill of Rights that can take care of that. We don't need another bureaucratic labor agency in Washington, D.C., and that's what we're kind of getting. And in terms of spending, and we are spending lots of billions of dollars on the Native Americans and lands, and really, what has that really accomplished? I mean, the amount of poverty is still there, and if you compare reservations like the Lakota Sioux, which they're one of the poorest, and you compare them to the Choctaw Reservation down in Mississippi, they write their own rules, and so they don't have a government telling them what they can and can't do. So consequently, they've got contracts for McDonald's and silverware, and they have some other contracts that do provide good jobs that are providing schools and hospitals for their folks. Thank you.
All right, next we're going to go ahead and move into the panelist questions. Ms. Luella Bryn will be asking the first questions of the candidates. The order she'll be asking the questions are Velazquez, Fellows, Rehberg, and we will also proceed in that order for the rebuttals. Ms. Bryn, please ask your question.
Ms. Velazquez, how do you propose rural reservation schools obtain the proper funding to comply with the No Child Left Behind Act?
Well, first I need to say that if I had my preference, I would do away with the No Child Left Behind Act. I have talked with people all over Montana, and they have told me that No Child Left Behind has been a disaster for Montana's schools. It has been an expense that has not been paid for by the federal government, and maybe even as important to that, it has taken away local control from school districts. We already have school districts that are accountable. They're accountable to school boards. They're accountable to parents. They're accountable to all of us. And we don't need the federal government to come from Washington and tell us whether our schools meet standards. We have to decide what those standards are and how we're going to meet them. I'm very concerned that the federal government is not meeting its obligations for Indian schools. The budget right now for Indian schools is flat, and while the budget for the entire United States for the president's proposed budget is an increase of 3%. There are going to be cuts to Indian school buildings, new buildings, Indian school improvement funds. Tribal colleges are supposed to take a hit. This is not what we need here in Montana or in the United States. What we need is more help and less government intervention and more authority to help make this happen. I think there's a lot of things that can be done. I'm certainly not someone who thinks money can solve all problems, but the problems of rural schools and schools for Indian kids are serious, and one of the things we need to do is provide things like funds to get teachers to teach in rural areas, including in Indian schools, and find ways to reward those who do a good job.
Mr. Fellows, you'll have 1 minute for rebuttal, if you'd like.
Well, I think the Department of Education on a national level has simply failed us. Our test scores have gone down. We were #1 in math and science. Now we're down to 21st and 22nd. We need to get rid of the Department of Education. That way we could take a lump sum, give it to the states, and that certainly would pay for any education that we need. Keep it on a local level. Let's get the government out of it.
Mr. Rehberg, 1 minute.
I'm not prepared to allow one single child to fall behind. I did, in fact, support No Child Left Behind because it is the concept that we need to recognize where the problems are and then provide additional help to those children that are, in fact, falling behind. The best way to help Native American students is to identify who is falling behind and see that they have the resources. As a result, I am a co-sponsor of legislation to fully fund Impact Aid. What is Impact Aid? It's a recognition that there is not a tax base nor an ability on a reservation in many cases to help those students because there is not enough taxpayer dollars. It is a recognition on the state of the federal government to in fact contribute additional income or revenue to those schools. No Child Left Behind is accountability. Let's make a determination. Is it about money or is it about the type of education we're providing? We can have both. We can have accountability, we can have the revenue, and I might add it is not underfunded at No Child Left Behind because we increased federal spending 12.5% for No Child Left Behind.
Ms. Bryn, go ahead and ask your second question.
Mr. Fellows, with many reservation unemployment rates hovering around 70%, if elected, how do you plan on expanding economic development for Montana tribes?
Well, I think if we consider that reservation residents need to decide what citizenship they want, whether it's being an American citizen or citizen of their own reservation, that they're sovereign so that they can just make their own rules and regulations. And if we look at the example of like the Choctaw tribe, which I described about, they simply got a waiver from the federal government that they could allow themselves to make their own choices about those things. So they brought in industries. Like I said, they brought in McDonald's. They're employing people at pretty good wages. They brought in a company that's making speakers for automobiles. That's providing some good wages. And so what we need to do is look at those options and open up the markets so that we can provide that. And consequently, what usually happens is the federal government puts strings in here, and then we're tied to whatever the feds want us to do. And I think we're just stuck in this cycle of poverty, depression, whatever else that usually is out there. And we need to break that cycle. And so we need to have the tribes look up new innovations. And it simply just can't be casino or casino businesses and like that. That we've got to expand. Instead of those companies doing outsourcing to other countries, they could expand here on the nation's reservations.
Mr. Rehberg, 1 minute.
I have a history of working with the Native Americans on economic development. As Lieutenant Governor, I created the Montana Rural Development Council. It was a council that was made up of federal, state, local, tribal, for-profit, and non-profit organizations. Our specific purpose was to create an environment for economics to occur in Montana. More specifically, your own chairman, Carl Vann, was in my office just 2 weeks ago asking for my help to help Westmoreland Coal expand into a little area of the Crow Reservation. I gladly lend my support to that kind of endeavor, as I have worked practically on a weekly or daily basis with S&K Technologies and S&K Industries to help them get a foot up within the procurement area of the federal government and also to create the kind of jobs that are not reliant upon federal funding.
Ms. Velazquez, 1 minute, please.
Thank you. When I have talked with people around Montana, rural economic development is probably one of the most important issues that they talk about. And the same goes for on our Indian reservations. The problems are very similar. The first is a problem of capital. Capital is what helps you start a business. And many Indians have a problem with capital because of the fact that the land is tribally owned and they don't have the resources to start a small business. Let's face it, Montana business is mostly small business. The problem of capital here is something that needs to be solved, and I believe that we can create revolving loan funds. We can create a system to enable people to have the capital they need. The other issue is a question of being able to have the knowledge and the resources to start a small business. And I had the opportunity to visit with someone on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation at the tribal college there, and they have a great program there. They're starting with kids. They're teaching them about money. They had a little store. They had to have their own business. And they're working with families there to come up with ways to show them how to start a business. And I think this is a great way the government can help.
All right, and if we could please just try to stick to the time, I'd appreciate that. Thank you. Ms. Bryn, your third question, please.
Mr. Rehberg, networking is an integral part of the political process. If re-elected, how would you create networks with every Montana tribe, and how would you keep the lines of communication open?
The same way that I have over the course of the last 4 years. In fact, I traveled all 56 counties every year. Why? Because there are 56 unique personalities, 56 cultures within the various communities of Montana. I have also embarked upon a 7-reservation tour. The reason I did that was an opportunity to sit down with each of the reservation, with each of the tribal councils, to find out what are the issues that are most specific to those reservations. I have also sponsored women's health conferences in Billings for all the reservations. I've also sponsored hearings in Montana and in Washington, D.C. to deal with the trust issue. I brought people in from all the reservations into one location to talk about the opportunities for a mediated settlement on the trust responsibilities of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We got 7 different answers, and we're trying to move forward with those kinds of discussions. But I think I've got a history of that, and I believe in the consensus building process of bringing the elected officials in from the sovereign nations of the 7 tribes to talk about the opportunities, whether it's economic development, health, education, or any of the other issues of the day that are most specific to the Native Americans. And so rural economic development, it is a major part, but government oftentimes creates impediments for the opportunity to create economics within the reservations or anywhere within the country. And so what we have to do is make sure that the regulations are not unfair. We need to make sure that the taxation isn't unfair. That's one of the reasons I entered into the arena of the Rural Education Caucus, and I created one in Washington because I saw that many areas of No Child Left Behind were not specific to the rural areas. We most recently had the president sign an executive order to understand that No Child Left Behind needed to understand the cultural differences of the reservations from the other schools within Montana and this nation. And we were successful in convincing the president to create a task force to study the differences so we could make it very specific to the tribes.
Ms. Velazquez, please.
Well, if elected to Congress, the first thing I would do would be to create a liaison position to the tribes. I know that Senator Baucus has one staff person, and that's their job, is to be on the ground, and their only job is to work with the Native American population in Montana. And my primary opponent, Mr. Rehberg, has spent a disproportionate amount of money on things like mailings when he could have been spending it on things like having someone represent Montanans, another person represent Montanans. And because the issues on the reservations are many times specific due to questions of sovereignty, due to the high rate of unemployment here, I think this is a great first step.
And Mr. Fellows.
Well, somebody that would work in Montana that could coordinate with the tribes would be helpful. I think in this day of internet and computers, that also can bring information to people at a very fast pace, and I think that's something we need to certainly look at. Certainly in the campaigns that I've involved with, we've gotten information out to people in a very fast hurry, and even places like Oregon, when they need to get an issue out to the press, they can generate that stuff pretty fast and have the volunteers there to do it. So I think that's going to be very important to try to incorporate that into any kind of campaign office, or I should say congressional office that we have with liaisons in Montana and also in Washington, D.C.
All right, next, Mr. Bernard Adger will be asking questions of the candidates in the order of Mr. Fellows, Rehberg, and Velazquez. Mr. Adger, please ask your first question.
Yeah, they're somewhat the same, but hopefully they're different. Montana's economy is heavily tied to the federal purse. The state receives more money than we pay back in taxes. Money comes for agricultural subsidies, highway funds, among other things. What would you do to make the state less dependent upon federal funding without, I guess, to create jobs that are not
Right.
federal? Yeah.
And that's one thing we've talked about for a long time, is essentially that Montana does get its fair share of what I like to call pork projects, because there's some projects that obviously aren't needed. When you look at a parking garage in Bozeman, I wonder how that's going to benefit people in Sydney or people in Miles City. And we talk about farm subsidies. Are they really going to the family farmers that probably need them? No, they're going to the Daniel Midland Company, going to people like Ted Turner, even Sam Donaldson got his subsidies because it's there and it's allowed and he could afford them. And so we need to look at some of that. The Citizens for Government Waste last year ranked as 10th. Now we're 6th in terms of the amount of pork we bring here. So we need to do, I think, in terms of agricultural type things, is open up new markets. I mean, we shouldn't have to import all our hemp products from Canada so they can make the shirts, the pants, versus whatever else products that we have. Those are things that we should be growing ourselves and marketing ourselves. And there's probably a lot of other products out there that we could do that could help us. In terms of things like highways, we certainly have to fix the roads that pay for the highways. That's why we have gas taxes and user fees that pay for those things. And I think we're going to have to continue to have those things so they can pay for the gas taxes. But we shouldn't have a highway bill that's going to stick in museums like the Greyhound Museum for Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or other museums out there, because the highway bill is simply to maintain highways, and we need to look at the things within the highway bill and just get rid of all the things that really aren't necessary.
All right, Mr. Rehberg, 1 minute.
You bet. Energy policy is one of the major areas that I've worked in. I want to help create the natural resource industry, or recreate the industry that are the high-paying jobs in Montana. We have great opportunities in clean coal technology, the fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, in addition to the alternatives, wind and solar and geothermal and all the exciting technologies that we haven't even thought of yet. We're working on grants and loans to help people invent us into the next generation of energy production. And we're also looking at conservation ideas, and we've got some exciting arenas there. In addition, in agriculture, I use the Innovation Center as an example of something that I had attached to the Farm Bill, creating an opportunity to have an Innovation Center in Montana State University to help people add value to their agricultural product, bringing them up from the commodity level so they can enter into a higher stream of income generation. Those are the kind of ideas that I've brought forward in the past and look forward to working on in the future.
And Ms. Velazquez.
Well, I think you have to be careful when you're talking about government programs because they're not all the same. Some of them, for instance, are set up by treaty. The treaties for Indian health care, these treaties for Indian education. I don't think that it's the right thing to say we need to reduce the federal budget, so we're going to cut Indian health care and we're going to cut Indian education. On the flip side, I'm very concerned that we do have a system right now where it's the incumbents who are always trying to bring home projects to try and look good during election year. Where the balance is, I'm not sure, but when you look at things like Social Security, that's a large part of the money that we get from the federal government. I'm not in favor of privatizing Social Security, and I think we need to look carefully at the special favors and interests that are impacting the decisions made in Washington.
All right, Mr. Adger, your second question, please.
Our national parks were created to protect the natural environment for all people to enjoy. Just recently, the federal district judge lifted the ban on snowmobiles in Yellowstone National Park. Meanwhile, the state of Montana policy is to kill the bison that wander off the park. Is there something wrong with this picture? Do you think wildlife and snowmobiles are compatible in our parks?
And Mr. Rehberg, you'll have 2 minutes for
I
that.
do believe that wildlife and recreation are compatible. If you listen to the Intertribal Council, they in fact support the management of bison. The bison that are killed are the ones that are diseased. Those that are healthy are taken back into the park. as there were people from downtown New York City trying to change the management of the bison herd because they're overpopulated within Yellowstone Park. We are currently managing them, but people from New York and other parts of urban areas around the country were trying to come in and tell us how we could better manage our natural resources, as Mr. Hinchey, a congressman from New York City. I do believe that if reasonable minds can get together, they can, in fact, have multiple use management within our national parks. If you look at the reaction as a result of the judge's most recent decision, nobody suggested we go back to the way it was with snowmobiles. Everybody still wants to find a consensus. The lack of consensus on the part of the Clinton administration is what brought us to this position, where they said that there's 100% of Yellowstone Park and 1% is used for snowmobile access. 99% is not. And that wasn't good enough for the extreme environmental organizations. They wanted to shut off the personal use of snowmobiles entirely. That was an unreasonable intrusion, we believe, in multiple use management. The federal government encouraged businesses to set up around the park so those entities wouldn't be built in the park. Entire economies were created for the opportunity of enjoying our national parks, and then they come in and say, well, sorry, we're going to cut your income in half because we no longer support snowmobiles within Yellowstone Park or the personal use. We did not think that was reasonable. We tried to find a consensus. We thought we had found a consensus, and then a Washington, D.C. judge changed the rules right before the last season. We continue to try to find the consensus that will allow an opportunity for reasonable access for all to use their national park, and we just believe that there can be access, multiple use access, it's federal properties, and there can in fact be a good wildlife and environmental management at the same time.
And Ms. Velazquez, 1 minute.
Thanks. Excuse me. Well, Mr. Rehberg and I agree on principle on this. I do believe it's a mess. We have to find some consensus on this, and we need to make compromises. I think that the extreme environmentalists, as he calls them, have served an important purpose in that they have pushed for the invention of cleaner and quieter snowmobiles. And those, I think everyone agrees, are a great step. I don't support banning snowmobiles from Yellowstone. I believe in looking at good science and making sure that we're looking at science and we're helping businesses have stability, because that's what's been lacking, is stability, and also the resources to help them. I know that Mr. Rehberg was in West Yellowstone fending the flames with business owners there, when I think what we really needed was some money in their economy or in research to see how to move them forward into perhaps different areas for the future.
And Mr. Fellows, you'll have 1 minute, please.
Well, I think when you look at parks like Glacier National Park, it was founded by a private citizen who thought it was nice enough to save. Certainly, Yellowstone down there, I think we need, as Congressman Rehberg says, we need to find some consensus on the issue. I certainly wouldn't want the towns of Gardner and some of those towns to suffer economically, because that's would simply, if you look at the Constitution, it might be considered a takings for that matter. I think there are certain trails that should be off limits probably based on that, and that's what the consensus building could be all about, is finding those trails, staying on those trails, and working together so we can find solutions instead of having it come top down from Washington, D.C., whether it's executive orders or whether it's from the president or whether it's done by legislation. I think it's better done locally here than back in D.C.
All right. And at this time, if I could please ask the audience to refrain from shows of support. If we could just wait till the end, please, in the nature that we need to keep moving ahead with all the questions that need to be asked. Okay, Mr. Azure, if you could please ask your third and final question of Ms. Velazquez.
War is ugly, and the Iraq war seems to be becoming increasingly ugly every day. We have found no weapons of mass destruction. People are being beheaded, and today we've heard about a transportation unit that has refused to transport fuels across Iraq because of their alleged claim of deficiencies in the trucks and reporting. Several people have started expressing doubts about our ability to win that war, including Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. And I'm just wondering, do you think it's right that we should be over there? And if you have children, would you send them over there?
And Ms. Velazquez, 2 minutes.
Thank you. people have asked me, if you were in Congress, would you have voted for the war? And I tell them, I don't know, because I don't know what information the Congress people were given, and so I can't say what decision I would have made. But I can tell you now that this was not the right decision. Where there weren't any weapons of mass destruction, we had poor information, we didn't build enough alliances, and now we're in a situation where we have very large casualties for us and very large costs as well. I think that that the situation has not been improving substantially, and that concerns me. But in my heart, I think that it's important that we try to stabilize that country. It's sort of like that mom in me, you know, if you made a mess, clean it up. And so I'd like us to stay there, and hopefully with some increased international support, help them get their country more on track. My kids, when they get to be adults, they'll have to make their own decisions. And I just hope that we have built our military strength and built more friends internationally so that they will be able to make a decision and not have a decision made for them.
All right, Mr. Fellows, you'll have 1 minute.
Well, I think nobody really likes the aspect of war, and I don't either. I know when we talk about World War II, we had people under the age of 16 lying about their age, sign up to get rid of Hitler and save freedom and American values around this country. And so I think I didn't like the war from the onset, but we're already in there. And since we're in there, we do have to give our troops the amount of materials and equipment they need to actually get the job done. And so and I think the president also needs a good exit strategy so that we can get out of there, because I've heard times anywhere from 3 years to 14 years that we're going to have to be in there to actually bring this theory of democracy to the people of Iraq. I mean, they've been doing their fighting, infighting, and for thousands of years, and we're not going to change that overnight.
And Mr. Rehberg, 1 minute.
I did vote to give the president the authority to make that decision. It was a preemptive strike. Rather than manage, we need to prevent. This gentleman, Saddam Hussein, had the desire, the means, the will, and the history of moving beyond his borders. There were those that apologized after Pearl Harbor. There were those that apologized when Hitler forced us into a war that we did not want to be in. We lost an entire generation of young men and women because we waited. Did you want us to wait in this particular case and then talk to our younger children and look them in the eye and say, I'm sorry, but we created a situation where we can no longer ignore it. We're in too late. It's going to be much more serious. Or would you rather have us made the decision where we could do it as easily, as quickly, as quietly as possible? Do all decisions work out the way we intend them? No, they don't. But we make the best of trying to make the management decisions based upon the change. Would I encourage my children? I would. My children can make their own decision, but I will give them the tools, the means, and the desire to protect our nation so that we don't have the Saddam Husseins threatening our security.
All right. And again, I'd just like to remind the candidates since I've admonished Ms. Velazquez, I have to also ask you, Mr. Rehberg, please try to stick to the time. Thank you. Our third panelist now is Ms. Kimberly Swaney, and she will be asking questions in the order of Mr. Rehberg, Ms. Velazquez, and Mr. Fellows. Ms. Swaney, your first question, please.
Congressman Rehberg, during your tenure of office, Congress has continually underfunded the Indian Health Service by 50 to 60% of what is necessary. What do you propose to do to correct the misappropriations or the underfunding of the Indian Health Service in light of the $200 billion that has been given to the war in Iraq?
I continually work on health care as my #1 issue in the United States Congress. I probably spend more time on the problem that we see existing growing of the differences between the ability to afford the technology and the technology itself. Indian Health, I believe, is underfunded as well. It's one of the reasons I joined the Diabetes Caucus, because we can look at specific areas where we want to try and help. We're also looking at specific areas to bring additional resources to the Indian Health Service, such as nursing. Money is an answer. We can, in fact, fully fund if we set our mind to a reprioritization. Unfortunately, in my tenure, which has been 4 years, there are so many areas that the prior Congresses, under Democrat leadership, I might add, have underfunded, whether it's Medicare changes, our prescription drug coverage for seniors, which has been promised since 1967 and never delivered. our highway programs, our economic programs, all the kinds of things that we have wanted to fund. We'll use veterans as another example. The Veterans Health Care Administration has gone up 40%, and it's still not enough. And so what we're trying to do, we're trying to make up as quickly as possible the underfunding of the various programs that we think has existed, while at the same time trying to protect our security. And what's more important in this nation, than trying to protect our security? It's the one thing that exists currently within our Constitution that everybody agrees with, that we do not want to fight a war on our shores. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to balance the various costs of the war on terror, the war in Iraq, and all the various human service needs that we have identified that need to be accomplished, while at the same time making sure there is no waste, there is no fraud, and there's no abuse. So I continue to work with the tribes around the state and within the nation to try and see that education is fully funded, healthcare is fully funded, and that we have the opportunity to create the economic development so you're not dependent on foreign or federal sources for your programs.
Ms. Velazquez, 1 minute, please.
I don't think those excuses are enough. Indian Health Service has grown at a rate of almost less than 1% over the past 4 years. In fact, right now it is funded at, I believe it is 2001 levels. This is inexcusable. Right now, the Flathead Reservation is in a compact, and the way it's set up, they are underfunded because of the formulas that are set up with the government because of their not having a direct IHS. I believe that the issue of healthcare is huge. Prevention needs to happen. We need to be able to get people in before they have serious health problems, and I don't think there's any excuse for underfunding IHS, and I will make sure it doesn't happen.
And Mr. Fellows, 1 minute, please.
Well, I think in some ways it's the government getting into the notion of healthcare that's caused a lot of problems from a bureaucratic standpoint. I do think that some programs out there on the private market, like Simple Care, which is a program that was set up by private doctors, so that when people go in to see a patient, they spend more time with the doctor than they do filling out health insurance forms. If we do need more money for health clinics, one problem to deal with that is to try to raise everybody in the reservation so that we bring more jobs, bring more industry, so that we do have those funds necessary to provide the good health care, and we can bring in the doctors and make it so it's not so bureaucratic, so that we're not sending all our money back to D.C. and only getting a portion of it back here to the states.
All right, and Ms. Swaney, you can go ahead and ask your second question, please.
Tracy, what does tribal sovereignty mean to you, and how will you utilize that knowledge to deal with tribes here and all across the nation?
Well, tribal sovereignty is a very important concept. I attended Montana State University's Wheeler Center had a very good conference talking about Native American sovereignty, and that was my first real exposure, I have to say, to the issue. I believe very strongly in a nation-to-nation relationship. I'm very concerned about some of the steps that the United States government is taking right now in terms of block grants to the state, and what happens to that money if there's disputes over it, whether it's going to mean that the Flathead Nation, for instance, is dealing with the state rather than the federal government. I do think that right now we're at a crossroads in trying to make sure that this sovereignty is maintained. I think that the act that allows the tribes to take over different functions of the federal government is a great first step. And I think that the Bison Range is one example of a way that can happen. The compacts that allow the Flathead Nation to take over IHS functions and try and provide health care on their own is a good step too. And the more that we can build capacity within the different reservations, the better off that they'll be and their people will be in the long run. Because this is, as you know, the issues on the reservations are serious, and I believe that it's very important that the tribes are intimately involved with the solutions. I think the way that the BIA restructuring is being handled right now is a good example of what shouldn't happen in terms of relationships with the government.
And Mr. Fellows, 1 minute.
Well, I think sovereignty is important. I think the individuals themselves, along with the tribe, should decide which nation they want to belong to. I think we do have to keep track of our treaties, and we've signed these treaties, and we look at things like the Black Hills, where they signed the treaties, and then they came back and reneged on those treaties since we found gold. I think once we sign these things, we should keep them in place. Things like the national, the bison range, a lot of people are really concerned about the cost effects of things like that. Hand them over to the tribe themselves. If it was simply just a handover, that's one thing, but we're talking about spending more than we're doing now. So I think the tribes do have a say in what they need to do, and they should have, rather than having the feds tell them what they can and can't do.
And Mr. Rehberg, 1 minute.
Therein lies the dilemma of the debate that we have in Washington, D.C., the difference between your two questions. On the one hand, you asked, how can we send more money from the federal government to solve your health care issue? On the other hand, you want to recognize the sovereignty of an independent nation. We go through this debate every day. And part of the debate is, how are we going to create independence for the people within the tribes or within the reservations? How are we going to create an economic opportunity for them and ourselves as individuals, whether it's within the state of Montana, the city of Polson, or the Salish Kootenai, to take care of themselves, to try and provide alternatives and options and choices within healthcare, within education, within economic development. Sovereignty is something that is recognized within the treaties that we created, but at the same time, we don't want the various reservations to become wards of the nation, because that's not what the tribal members necessarily want, and that's probably not what the rest of the nation wants. So we continually try, through issues as we talked about before, the Rural Development Council, to create economic opportunities.
All right, and Ms. Swaney, your third and final question, please.
Mike, what kind of attributes do you have that you think would make you a good congressman for the tribes and for the state of Montana?
Well, I think, one, I like to read a lot. I certainly listen to people. In real life, I work with old folks, and so I work with a lot of different kinds of people, kinds of different behaviors. We have to do a lot of modifications. You're dealing with people that sometimes really don't have a mind, and so you're trying to deal with those folks the best way you can. And so I think, as I told a lot of people quite a few years ago, that really all the qualification for Congress should be what's in the Constitution, but as long as I got some common sense, as long as you can read the bills and understand what's going on, rather than relying on the bureaucrats, relying on the lobbyists, I think we do just fine, and I think those are some of the things that would suit me just well back in D.C., because a lot of congressmen don't read the bills. After the Patriot Act, it was a very, very emotional time that there was probably nobody on Capitol Hill that read the bill. On the NAFTA agreement, 20,000 pages. What congressman had time to read 20,000 pages? Not very many. And so the things that they're passing, with all the amendments and all the other stuff that gets shoved into these bills, really has me worried. I think bills should stand on their own merit without these amendments going in there, because if you got $20 billion for one program and the bill's about something else, well, you don't want to lose the $20 billion, so you're going to vote for it anyway, even though you might not like the bill as a whole. And so those are some things that we certainly should look at.
And Mr. Rehberg, 1 minute, please.
Well, having spent my entire life in Montana does help, because my mom side of the family, my mom was born and raised on the Cheyenne Reservation. The rest of the family, my grandmother, my aunts and uncles all grew up on the Crow Reservation. My grandfather, in fact, worked for the BIA for 40 years. I think what makes me uniquely qualified is I try and treat every individual as an individual within the state of Montana, to understand that there are unique needs and unique concerns for each individual, not just Native American, but all Montanans and anyone that wants to become a Montanan. And so I look for the alternative to listen and learn and try and help the people of Montana. And how do I do that? To continually traveling around, talking, meeting, hearing, listening, and trying to help back in Washington, D.C., create coalitions of like-minded people like J.D. Hayworth and John Shattuck and Jeff Flake and Brad Carson and others that have Native American populations within their communities, to try and build a more secure future for them, as well as all Montanans and all Americans.
All right, and Ms. Velazquez, 1 minute, please.
Well, I think that there's a number of things that will enable me to be a good congressperson. One is that I am not beholden to special interests. Mr. Rehberg just had his campaign finance report come out. Less than half of his money came from individuals. 48% of it came from PACs. I don't think that makes a good congressman, because you cannot represent people if you take all of your campaign money, or a great portion of it, from special interests. I'm a small business owner. I came of modest means. I'm the first generation to go to college. My dad didn't even graduate from high school. I know what it's like to work for a living. I'm not a millionaire. And I would like to go to Washington and represent people like you here in this audience, people who have to work for a living, people who depend on Social Security, people who just want to make Montana a better place to live for themselves and their families.
All right, thank you. At that time, that concludes the component of our forum that is the panelist questions. Thank you. And now we'll move into the part where we will ask questions that the audience has actually submitted in writing. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer the questions. And we will go ahead and go in this order for the first question: Velazquez, Rehberg, Fellows, and then we will just kind of move down that order with that alternating. Okay, the first question I'd like to ask, this will be to Ms. Velazquez initially. How do you think the water rights issue should be solved on this reservation? And you'll have 2 minutes for that.
Well, I think that that water rights, and I have to admit that I'm not very knowledgeable on water rights on this reservation, so I'll have to talk in general. The issue of water rights is perhaps the most important issue, natural resource issue facing Montana as we move forward. We've got issues with water from Canada, we have issues with water going south from Fort Peck, and we have issues with water here on this reservation. I do think that it's something that is very serious, and I think we need to look at who has original water rights and what that means. So all I can tell you is that for me, it's going to be a matter of trying to bring people together who are knowledgeable, look very seriously at who has the rights, who has and what's at stake, and what are the solutions that we can come up with, because I believe that that's the way it's going to have to be handled. And I apologize for not knowing more about this issue on your reservation.
And Mr. Rehberg, 2 minutes.
I have been intimately involved in the water rights issue on the reservation. In fact, I first worked for Conrad Burns in 1989, and when he came up onto the reservation, it was the first time a United States Senator had come up and met with both the tribal members and the joint board. They thanked him for that. Unfortunately, nothing occurred from 1989 to the present. So I know the contentiousness of the issue. I'm not going to try and tell you how you're going to solve that issue, but what I can tell you is that I'm ready, willing, and able to carry the legislation once you make the determination. There is a consensus building process that is occurring on the reservation as we speak. Alan Nicholson, my former chief of staff, has been brought in as a mediator between the joint board and the tribe to try and come to a successful conclusion, and I hear good reports. I understand they're getting very close, and they've been keeping me informed as to the type of solutions they're coming to, and so I look forward to seeing the work product that you're all willing to bring forward, and I'll carry that legislation on your behalf when it goes through to the United States Congress. Water rights is one of those difficult issues. The one thing that I will see that never happens is I will work like a dog not to allow the federal government to step in and try and take control of our water rights. The water rights were established by both treaty and by prior use, and I believe so strongly that we must solve it within that perspective, and the federal government does not have a role in Montana's water rights. It will lessen our ability to manage Flathead Lake. It lessens our ability to manage the irrigation water that's flowing through and out of this reservation. And so it's something that I'm very deeply involved in. In fact, I married my attorney, and she's a water rights attorney. And so I get a lot of advice from my wife as to water rights issues. It's contentious. It's the kind of thing we fight about. But again, I understand that you're getting very close to a consensus, and I wholeheartedly thank you for that. And I want to be intimately involved in the legislation supporting it.
And Mr. Fellows, 2 minutes.
Well, I think water rights has been a contentious issue. I know that there have been talks before between the state of Montana and the tribes to find out who actually owns the water. I know we're still discussing water rights in terms of the Missouri River upflow users and Montana users. I've looked at other countries like Scotland. They have water rights, they have fishing rights, and so therefore they can protect their waters tremendously. If you do damage to people downstream, well, they have an economic right to come back and assess damages to you for those problems. And I think if we look at water as simply more of a property right versus versus a state right, because I know that the state in its constitution, to paraphrase, it says something to the fact that any water belongs to the state. So if you have a lake and it forms, and then the state wants to regulate it and everything else. And I think certainly it's a local issue, and I think we need local folks to look at the issue and do a consensus rather than having it come down from D.C.
All right, thank you. This next question will be in the order of Mr. Rehberg, Mr. Fellows, and Ms. Velazquez. Mr. Rehberg, what is your position regarding raising the standard of living by raising the minimum wage? You'll have 2 minutes.
I have supported raising the minimum wage in the United States Congress as long as there is a equal and parallel decrease in the tax and regulatory burden on the small businesses that it will impact the most. I don't get why it's better for a young person not to have a job, and they're usually the ones that are at risk. When you raise the cost of a small business doing business in Montana, as Tracy has mentioned, Montana is a small business state. When we have economic development, it's usually 1, 2, or 3 jobs at a time. We don't see the large increases in job that some other states and other manufacturing areas do. And so I believe in a standard of living for our workers. I will do everything I can to see that there's a standard of living, but at the same time we have to create the opportunity for those jobs to be created or expanded, or for our small businesses to have the ability to pay more. And there's really only 2 ways of looking at it. It's either taxation or regulation. It's not one tax, and it's not one regulation, but it's a cumulative effect of all the taxes and all the regulations that are coming down on small business that's keeping us from having the opportunity of hiring the young, of hiring those that are most at risk, that need the job, the starter job, or maybe the second job to support their family. And I guess I just do not understand how on one hand you can take a hidden tax increase by increasing the minimum wage while at the same time hurting the very people that cannot pass it on. Your larger companies can in fact pass it on, but your small businesses cannot. So if you recognize the fact that Montana is a small business state, if you recognize the fact that small businesses are the lifeblood of Montana, you have to recognize it's your taxation policy, it's your litigation policy, it's your regulation policy that oftentimes keeps them from being able to expand. And so I do in fact support a minimum wage increase as long as there is a recognition and a subsequent decrease in the cost to small business.
And Mr. Fellows, 2 minutes, please.
I think Congressman Rehberg is right in terms of regulation and taxation. Businesses in this country pay over $125 billion in regulatory costs. That $125 billion could go to business expansion, could go to higher wages for employees, it could go to more employees themselves. We need to look at the tax structure too. I think businesses are paying a lot more in taxes than they probably need to, and that's money that could also go towards employee benefits, expanding the company, so on and so forth. If you look at the minimum wage laws themselves, who's going to determine actually what a minimum wage technically is? I could probably survive at $25 an hour, but I'm sure that a lot of people wouldn't be willing to go to McDonald's and pay $12 for a hamburger if we're paying them $25 an hour. And so it has to commensurate with experience. And the doctors and lawyers are paid higher fees because they've got the experience, and we pay them for that experience. You've got some of the lower entry folks that might not have that experience, and do we want to force businesses to actually pay an artificially high price that is going to be passed on to consumers, and will consumers be willing to pay a higher cost for those goods? They may or may not be. That's one reason why we've got companies outsourcing their jobs to China, to Indonesia, and those places because of the high cost of things. And if we can get rid of the regulatory costs and get rid of some of the tax burdens so that we can keep some of these jobs here in the United States, that's where I think we ought to head with that.
All right, and Ms. Velazquez, 2 minutes, please.
Well, I had the opportunity, I was up in Great Falls the other day, and I visited with the head of their food bank there, and I said, well, tell me who the people are who are coming to the food bank. And he said, you know what? It's the working poor. Most of the people who come to the food bank have a job. Some of them have 2 jobs or 3 jobs. I also was in Helena. I visited with the community health clinic there, and I said to her, tell me who comes to the community health clinic, which is on a sliding scale. She said, you know what? It's the working poor. It's people who have a job or maybe 2 jobs, and they have jobs that don't have any benefits, and they can't afford health insurance. I talked with both of them. I said, is this a solution? And both of them said, is this a good solution? They said, no, the solution is better paying jobs for Montana. The question is, how do we get better paying jobs? I am a small business owner, so I know the challenges of having a small business. I've had a couple employees over the past couple years, and I pay them more than minimum wage. But what we need to do is looking at how we change Montana's economy so it's not a service economy. I do think we need to raise the minimum wage somewhat. I don't know what the answer is, but I would have to look very closely at raising, and I understand what Mr. Rehberg's saying about regulation, but we also need to look at our trade policy. We need to look at why our jobs are going overseas, and we need to look at education, why we're not being able to compete in terms of technology. We need to look at rural development, what we need in our small towns in order to attract businesses that pay good wages. And so I think it's a complicated issue, but a lot of it has to do with not being beholden to big corporations. Mr. Rehberg got a big donation from Halliburton this past month. I am very committed to keeping the focus on the people of Montana and the people of the United States who have to work for a living.
Thank you. This next question will be in the order of Mr. Fellows, Ms. Velazquez, and Mr. Rehberg. Mr. Fellows, please clearly state your answer. What is your position on stem cell research, and do you support it or not? 2 minutes.
Well, yes, I would support it. As somebody that does work in healthcare, I see a lot of Alzheimer's patients. I see a lot of people with MS and Parkinson's disease. And if we can find some cures so that later in life they're not suffering through their debilitating illnesses, I think we need to do that. I do understand the ethical risks of that, and understand the other side that says, no, we shouldn't do that because of some of those issues they put forth. But simply, we do need to work on this project, because if my grandparents or my parents are in that shape, I would like to find somebody that could put forth the medical research to help them out. And I know that Nancy Reagan has been pushing that. Would have liked to have that for her husband Ronald Reagan. So I think we do need to work on that.
All right, Ms. Velazquez, 2 minutes, please.
I'm going to save time for an extra question and say I agree with Mr. Fellows.
And Mr. Rehberg, 2 minutes, please.
I have spent 25 years working with the Montana Muscular Dystrophy Association, 3 terms as its president. I also am a very active Shriner, so obviously health of our children and health care is an issue that's very important and near to my heart. And you know what I like about the Montana Muscular Dystrophy Association nationally? They don't ask for any federal dollars. Now, probably the question is more specifically, do I support federal funding of embryonic stem cell research? And I do not. There's a current existing strain. I believe in allowing the opportunity to use that current existing strain, but I do not understand why we need to create life to destroy life. And I don't think federal dollars ought to be spent for research. Federal dollars, your taxpayer dollars, going to embryonic stem cell research. I do support stem cell research. I do support private stem cell research. It can be done with adult stem cells. It's being done very efficiently and very effectively within the agencies that I've worked in or the associations. So I'm a strong advocate for finding solutions to tomorrow's and today's problems through the kinds of voluntary opportunity or economic vitality that is created through the free market system. I just don't believe that the federal taxpayers and those that are opposed to federally funding of embryonic stem cell research should continue to occur.
All right. This next question will be in the order of Ms. Velazquez, Mr. Rehberg, and Mr. Fellows. Ms. Velazquez, what can Congress do to protect the homeland of the Salish and Kootenai tribes with respect to the development of Highway 93? You'll have 2 minutes, please.
Well, I think the most important thing that they can do is to have the Salish and Kootenai be the ones who are the arbiters of what the best way to have that development happen. I saw an article in the paper that talked about some of the impacts that they were looking at mitigating when they built that highway, and I know that that's something that I think that the people here at the reservation need to be the ones who can make some of those final decisions. Is it worth it for us to have this additional traffic and noise? Is it worth it in terms of potential problems that might happen with wildlife? I can tell you as a citizen of Montana, 93 is one of the most hair-raising roads to drive on. And I would like to see it made safer, and I know you do too. And one of the issues around Native American health is that Indians have twice the rate of death from accidents of other people, so of Americans in general. So trying to make our roads safer, I'm sure, is a goal that we all share. And I think the bottom line comes down to, what do you think about these lands and the fact that this is your land? And while obviously you believe in there being a right of way there across your land, because for your own businesses and your own people, making sure that it's something that's right for you is the ultimate decision.
And Mr. Rehberg, 2 minutes, please.
Boy, does this bring back memories. When I became lieutenant governor in 1991, I suggested to Governor Stan Stevens, who appointed me, there were 2 issues that I wanted to try and solve before I left the office of lieutenant governor. One was workers' compensation, and one was Highway 93 through the reservation. Boy, was I in for quite an education. Literally, the first meeting that I attended had to do with Highway 93. It occurred both in Kalispell, in Ronan, and in Missoula. And at that time, it became very apparent that there was a disconnect between what the Montana Department of Transportation wanted to build and what the residents of Lake County wanted to build. It became very obvious that it was not going to be your basic 2-lane with a 3rd lane in the middle, or a divided highway, without some kind of a recognition that this is unique. It is cultural, there is wildlife, and it is a entryway to the Flathead, and it's something that deserves special recognition and additional funding. I have supported the changes that were necessary to make it both attractive and culturally sensitive to the tribe, as well as the residents that occur here. I will continue doing that. I'm very active on the Transportation Committee. In fact, I serve on the Conference Committee that's currently trying to work out, and we have the Highway 93 bypass around Kalispell as one of the 3 projects that were included in that bill. So I recognize the compromises and the consensus that have gotten us to this point. I will continue to support it any way I can, and whatever is reasonably done for this area to take care of the unique needs for this reservation and for the citizens that are traveling through. The one thing we cannot say is that if we don't build it, they won't come, because even if we don't build it, people will come to this area. Both the recreate and for economic development is going to happen whether we like it or not. And so we have to make it as safe as possible, and we can do it with the recognition of the cultural and the wildlife aspects.
And Mr. Fellows, 2 minutes, please.
Well, I think we're going to have to come up with some kind of compromise. I think if we look at the Kootenai and Salish tribe as their own sovereign nation, and then they shouldn't have to look to mandates with the Department of Education or the federal government. They should be making those choices themselves. What does kind of bother me is, though, the folks that live alongside Highway 93 and that may be displaced when they widen the highway. Are they going to get comparable compensation so they can move their homes someplace else? Are they going to get a fair market value for those properties? And I think that's something else that, just because the feds do it, I don't think it really makes it right. I think we need to also look at when big corporations simply do the same thing. When Walmart comes to an area and says, well, we're just going to do eminent domain on 12 families because it's going to be better on local governments. If we get rid of those 12 families, build a big super Walmart, we'll have all kinds of customers coming. I don't think I like that either, but I think it's better to solve these problems on a local level than having some mid-level or low-level bureaucrat somewhere trying to make choices, and when they don't even get out here. And just on bureaucrats, somebody once mentioned that the person that makes the grazing legislation hasn't been west of Cleveland. And so we do have bureaucrats making legislation that affects us, but they're not out here. We are.
All right. The next question will be asked in the order of Mr. Rehberg, Mr. Fellows, and Ms. Velazquez. Mr. Rehberg, what is your position on making Mr. Bush's tax cuts permanent?
I do, in fact, support making the tax cut permanent, especially the tax cuts on the marriage penalty. There should not be a penalty for getting married in the tax code. I believe that the tax reduction that occurred for the middle class, we have already made great efforts and made great strides in the Congress right before we adjourned to make those, to extend those tax breaks as well as the child tax credit. I believe that at a time when we're trying to pull ourselves out of a recession, when we're trying to create a more secure future for our citizens, that you don't continue to take money out of their pocket that they can use to feed their children, to buy their clothes, to set aside for their health care, to create educational opportunities, whether it be in VOTEC, additional supplemental education, or going to a college. And so I strongly believe that taxes have in fact been a clouding effect on our economy, and it gives families the opportunity to make a determination more than the government. What worse than a government that expands and grows because at a time that it had surpluses, it wanted to spend the money? Isn't it better to give families the opportunity to keep the money in their pocket, to make the determination how best to spend that? And so I've continually been an advocate of allowing the taxpayer to keep the money in their pocket, making their family decisions for themselves.
All right, Mr. Fellows, 2 minutes, please.
Well, I kept wondering why the government actually gave me back my $300 I sent in there in the first place. I would favor the tax cuts to be permanent. I do think that the tax rates in this country are too high. There's lots of things out there that I would probably like to buy if I had more money in my pocket, but every time I look at my paycheck and see that 30% going to government wasteful spendings and things of that nature in Washington, D.C., I have to wonder that it'd be better off if I spent it myself on local charities, on local communities, on organizations that'll do things locally to get things done. The problem with the President Bush's tax cut is that he tried to pay for these things with a credit card, and we simply can't do that. I mean, simply raising the debt ceiling every time we need money is the wrong answer, and I think we need to certainly reduce the federal budget. We need to find ways to look at the budget and get rid of some of these non-necessary spending programs that we have. And we've certainly got a lot of them where we're paying for the arts, we're paying for, like I mentioned before, Greyhound museums. Charles Schultz has his own museum that's paid for by tax dollars. And there's certainly a lot of things that we could look for. And I think the best way to improve the economy is to put more money back into individuals, put more money back into businesses so that they can buy products, spend on the economy, and that raises everything up. And so we do need to look at that, and I hope if I get into Congress, I certainly am going to look at legislation that will reduce the budget, look at those spending reductions, and I'm not simply just going to vote for any spending increase that comes along unless we have a reduction in spending that will compensate for those decreases.
All right, and Ms. Velazquez, 2 minutes, please.
Well, I am very concerned about some of the same issues Mr. Fellows is concerned about around our deficit and our debt. $400 billion deficit, $7+ trillion debt that we're looking at right now. These are fairly substantial. My opponent says he's in favor of tax cuts, and yet he refused to support pay-as-you-go legislation, which would have said, well, if you're going to give a tax cut, where's that money going to come out of the federal budget to match? He has refused to do that, and that concerns me. It also concerns me that the tax burden is shifting to the middle class. The Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan office of the federal government, which is run by a former Bush staffer, confirmed that the tax cuts are pushing the burden of taxes to the middle class. Those at the top end of the income level, those in the top 1%, which my opponent, Mr. Rehberg, got the largest share of the tax cuts. We here in Montana were among the states that got the lowest per capita tax cut back. Well, as your congressperson, I'm going to look and see how that tax cut affects people in Montana. Are we going to end up with a deficit that we all have to pay for and a debt we all have to pay for and our children have to pay for so that the more affluent people around the country get some money back? I don't believe in trickle-down economics. I believe in that the economy percolates up, and you need to give the folks at the bottom and in the middle the kind of money that's going to enable them to grow their businesses, buy products, invest in their children and their education. So, I'm really excited that the middle class did get a tax break, but we need more discipline in the federal government, and we need to make sure that the bulk of tax breaks go to people in the middle class.
All right, thank you. Excuse me. The next question will be asked in the order of Mr. Fellows, Ms. Velazquez, and Mr. Rehberg. Mr. Fellows, please answer yes or no with a follow-up explanation. Do you support the Bison Range Management Agreement between the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? 2 minutes, please.
At this time, my answer would probably no, based on the cost of the agreement that they're putting forth. Friends of mine tell me that's just going to be a blank check payable by the taxpayers, and I get worried about that. I know that the tribes were offered a range in the 80s. They got turned down. They were supplied with bison that I guess eventually went to slaughter. according to the people I've been talking to. And so there is concerns. If it was simply just handing over the bison range, giving it to the tribe's control, that's probably one thing. But if we're just having an open-ended check, I do have a problem with that.
All right, and Ms. Velazquez, please.
Well, I had the opportunity to look at the management plan. I had an opportunity to look at some of the revised figures for the costs and the fact that now they believe the cost will actually be reduced over a 5-year period, and the fact that this is not just a blank check. And based on those things, I think it's worth trying. It's part of this whole idea of giving control of the reservation and the different things on the reservation back over to the people who live here. As I understand it, no one's going to lose a job who has a job now. Fish, Wildlife, and Parks will be the final arbiter over whether they think that management is being done correctly, and that if for some reason it doesn't work out, it does go back to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. I think it's a win-win situation. I don't see what the downside is. So, I think it's worth trying. I'm certainly going to take a look at what the comment period says. I know it's been extended a couple weeks, and see if there's any new information that comes out. But right now, as it stands, I believe that this is worth trying. And it's not the first time it's happened. It's been done in other places around the country, and it's been successful.
And Mr. Rehberg, 2 minutes, please.
But I have not taken a position yet because I've been in the process of trying to make the system as fair as possible, giving everybody the opportunity to have their say. I thank the citizens for stepping forward and saying the numbers don't make sense. We don't trust Fish and Wildlife Service. And I have to admit, the numbers didn't make sense. And I was appalled at the fact that they did not have an opportunity when they asked for an extension period to have additional comments, that they were ignored. I thank the tribe, and I thank the Fish and Wildlife Service for recognizing the fact that the numbers were not adding up. And when I asked Chairman Matt to join with the Fish and Wildlife Service and me in announcing an extension period of 15 days, that they did that readily because they do not want to be set up for failure as well. If we make a determination that the transfer does occur, it almost seemed as if Fish and Wildlife was setting them up for failure, because if the numbers do not add up and they take over the management and they fail, then everybody's going to point fingers and say, see, we told you, they can't manage it, they did a bad job, we never should have turned it over to them in the first place. So I'm trying to create as open operation or alternative or chance for people to have their say. We've extended the period for 15 days at my request, as reported. At the close of that period, we'll have 90 days. I encourage each and every one of you that have an opinion on the bison range to send me your opinions so we can make the right decision to make our recommendations to the Fish and Wildlife Service. They tell us that it's not going to occur unless we agree. I don't know that for a fact. The executive branch does not need Congress's approval to affect the transfer. So I'm doing everything I can to see that everybody has an alternative to give their comments, and I look forward to receiving your comments. Please stay actively involved. You've got us to this point, and let's find a successful conclusion on the bison range.
All right, thank you. And this will be the last question from the audience in the order of Ms. Velazquez, Mr. Rehberg, and Mr. Fellows. Ms. Velazquez, what farm policies would you work for in Washington, D.C.? 2 minutes, please.
Farm or foreign?
Farm.
Farm, okay.
Excuse me.
Well, the first thing that I wanted to say is that it's been a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's been a pleasure to drive around Montana and meet with people in agriculture and hear what they have to say. Some of the things that I've heard have been very eye-opening to me, and when Mr. Fellows was talking about farm policy, I am very concerned that all the money doesn't go where it should go. And I'm also very concerned at the amount of special interest money that Mr. Rehberg has taken from various groups involved in agriculture. But I think that what we need to do is have a farm policy that makes sense in terms not only of what's good for growers, but also what's good for America. And I think a vibrant agricultural sector is good for America. You see where not having oil independence has gotten America. How would it be if we had to rely on other countries for food? I think that would be a nightmare for this country for security purposes. I would like to see more money going for innovation, for research and development, and I'd like to see more money going to growers. I'd like to see better policies that protect markets. If you look at some of the markets right now, they've become very vertically integrated. Almost all the congressmen from neighboring states have supported a captive supply bill that would give ranchers fairer markets for their beef. Mr. Rehberg has not supported that. We have a problem with the cost of shipping across out of Montana, where if you live in the Dakotas, it costs you less to ship across Montana to the coast than if you start in Montana and ship over. We have a problem with that too, and I'd like to see that fixed. And I believe that right now we're at a crossroads here in terms of our policies. I think that that NAFTA has put us in a competitive disadvantage. I'm very concerned about different trade agreements, and I would work very hard to make sure that we are not allowing foreign countries to dominate our food policy.
All right, Mr. Rehberg, please, 2 minutes.
Well, I want to thank the Montana Farm Bureau, the Montana Farmers Union, the Stock Growers Association, and all those other special interests that Tracy refers to as supporting my candidacy, because they clearly are the ones that are actively involved, as I am, in agriculture in Montana. Perhaps they support me because they don't support a hobby farmer from Connecticut. They support somebody with real agricultural backgrounds that clearly understand what it's like to make a living on a farm or a ranch. I, as a result of an estate tax problem with my great-grandmother in 1974, lost a third of my ranch and our home place, and all of our water and all of our corrals as a result of not being able to pay a tax and having to sell the property. It took my wife and I 20 years of hard work to pay that debt off, because the money we generated from selling a third of it and our home only paid the down payment on the estate tax. So I clearly understand what it's like to raise my family and make a living in agriculture and struggle every day with hauling 8,000 gallons of water a day because we're in the middle of a drought. I clearly understand what it's like to have a government action like a whole herd dairy buyout cost me 3 years of income because of a federal government that thought that they could increase the price of milk by flooding the market, thereby affecting the cattle market. So I clearly understand what it's like to have all your income tied up in a sugar factory down in Billings, and then have the government come and say, we've got a great idea. We're going to pass Central American free trade. Well, not under my watch. I'll do everything I can to see that, to keep that from happening. At the same time, opening up additional export opportunities in places like Cuba against my president, against my leadership. Again, Australian free trade, I voted against it, against my leadership, against my president, because I look out for what's in the best interest of the people of Montana, not Connecticut, not urban areas, not people that think they have an idea of how to add value to agricultural products, but somebody like myself who took the time to build an added value industry, such as cashmere goats on my place. So I have cattle, I have wheat, and I have goats. So I'm living the farm problem.
And Mr. Fellows, 2 minutes, please.
Well, I do think farm policy does have to change. I look at things more from a free markets perspective. When Congress passed the Freedom to Farm Bill in '96, I supported that. It kind of weaned farmers off subsidies, and most family farms were getting the subsidies anyway. We find all the Archer Denham, Midlands, and the Ted Turners of the world getting subsidies for their farms. And as the old joke goes, you know, my brother was getting all kinds of money for not raising pigs, and they decided to not raise corn and not raise everything else. So we're simply giving money away to not produce anything, and that's simply a problem too. In New Zealand, when they decided to get rid of agricultural subsidies, everybody thought there would be a collapse of the farming market, but in fact that hasn't happened. A few of the inefficient farms have certainly dropped out, but in the main part it's simply risen itself, and so they're still doing some good business down there in New Zealand. My grandfather was a farmer for many years. He was a teacher at Lewiston High School, basketball coach, football coach, chemistry teacher, and finally went into farming, and he did all right. He knew the problems of grain growing. He rotated his crops every so often, kept the ground fertile, and introduced a different crop every so often. It just hurts me sometimes when you see an article in the newspaper where a farmer grows wheat one year, he's not making enough money, but then he does the same thing the next year, expecting a different consequence. You know, and that's simply the definition of insanity, when you expect the same thing expect a different thing to happen all over again. And so we need to look at our subsidy program. We need to open up new markets, inform the farmers out there that there are some different things that we can do rather than trying to plant the same things over and over again. And I think the congressman is right about us paying for overproduction in terms of the dairy prices, in terms of the wheat prices. Stuff that sits in the government warehouse rots away, and that doesn't help the farmers. It just brings down the price because there's a glut in the marketplace, and that doesn't help anybody.
All All right, and we will end the night with concluding remarks, 2 minutes each, and we'll go in the order that was drawn initially, starting with Ms. Velazquez. 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and it's been great to be here. I've really enjoyed meeting with people. I would like to make one comment, in which is that I have been shocked and disappointed that Mr. Rehberg chooses in 2 debates out of 4 to insult my family and insult my background, and I want to know how that has added 1 job to Montana, how it has made 1 person's life better in Montana, and how it's given 1 person the health care or the education they need. So I've been shocked and disappointed that a sitting congressman would stoop to that level. On a positive note, it's been wonderful running for Congress. I can't tell you how many great people I have met around this state. I had a small business person up here in Big Fork actually come out of his store. I was getting gas, and he said, you know, Tracy, he saw my bumper sticker and recognized me. He said, Tracy, you know what? I usually vote Republican, but I'm going to vote for you because I don't think Washington cares about small business people like me. And I think he's right. Washington cares about big special interests. It cares about pharmaceutical companies. It cares about Halliburton. It cares about all of these cronies of the current administration. And Montana, that's not where Montana is. I want to go to Washington because I know that I can represent Montana. I have worked hard in my own life. I've worked hard on health issues. I've worked hard on education issues. I was the first generation to go to college. I managed to put myself through Harvard, and I'm very excited to be raising some great kids, one of whom I'm sure will walk in the door any second. And I think that you know, maybe I didn't grow up in Montana, but I moved to Montana because I wanted to live here, because I knew it was the best state in the nation. And all I want to do is go to Washington, listen to people in Montana, come up with some solutions that work for our state, and never keep my eye off the ball, and make all of my decisions not based on what the Republican leadership says or even what the Democratic leadership says, but what the people of Montana say. So thank you very much.
And Mr. Rehberg, 2 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear one more time in Lake County. Part of the direct mail that my opponent continually chastises me for sending are the kind of direct mail I send to you in Lake County continually, to come and meet with me, have town hall meetings, to have listening sessions so I can have an opportunity to best represent you. It's listening and learning and helping. Some of the publications I've sent out have been to try and educate our seniors to the wonderful benefits of a prescription drug coverage. They don't have to take it, there's an option, but Linda Price is sitting in the audience. She's one of my congressional staffers who happens to be coming back from Kalispell, where she had a listening session on prescription drugs so she could help seniors better understand the kinds of services that are going to be provided for the first time starting January 1 of 2006, but through the cards now. Listening and learning, traveling to all 56 counties, trying to build a more secure future for the people of Montana. Is it what I expected? It never is. You hire a manager of change. You have to have somebody that's willing to understand the issues of the day, to surround themselves with people like you that have the same vigor and enthusiasm for understanding what's going on in Montana, that has a clear understanding of what it was like to have a father like mine who went back to college at 48, the oldest student in his classroom, to better himself, to make a determination that he could provide a better future for his family because he was a short order cook in a restaurant, not some kind of rich person who came from a great background, but who made a determination that he didn't want to cook hamburgers anymore. He didn't want to have the cuts all over his hand. He knew what a minimum wage was like because he had a hard time paying it to his waitresses and his dishwashers. He had a hard time paying for himself. That's the kind of future I want to create for Montanans. That's why I continually work with people like yourself in Lake County and throughout Montana to understand the 56 counties, caring about each individual, understanding it's not the Dow Jones Industrial Average that makes us successful or a failure, but it's how we treat our most vulnerable, the people of the state of Montana. And thank you for your support, and I'm asking for your vote.
And Mr. Fellows, 2 minutes, please.
Well, thank you for inviting me here. I do think this debate has given us a lot of answers on a variety of issues, and I think we need that. I think the American public, and especially the voters in Montana, need to look at both sides of the issue, pro and cons, and make intelligent choices. I mean, a lot of voters obviously don't do that. We've got a number of voters that will not vote today. That's the none of the above crowd that thinks no matter what us as politicians up here do, that they're still going to get taxed higher, the government's still going to spend a lot of money, and they're still going to be involved in their private lives. And I think we need to change that, because in some cases, all we have is the difference between the tax and spenders and the borrower and spenders in Congress, and we need to change that. We need someone in Congress that's going to look at the deficit, that's going to look at the reduced spending, that's actually going to look at the budget if we're going to give tax credits. How are we going to pay for that? We can't just simply borrow on a credit card. We're going to have to look at place in the budget. That's probably a state issue and not a federal issue, because we need to look at constitutional issues like that. The federal government wasn't set up to be this big all organization that takes care of us from cradle to grave, and that's what the feds are trying to do, so that we're dependent upon them rather than taking the responsibility for our own actions. And I think we need to take responsibility for our own actions and do what we need to do. As a libertarian, I've certainly traveled around the state, putting more miles in my car than I need to probably, and I'm getting a lot of support from people because they see Congress back there as a Congress that's spending too much. They see these folks out there that call themselves fiscal conservatives or conservatives, and they're spending for the highest budget bill since President Clinton was in office, with Bush's federal budget. They're worried about their civil liberties. They're worried about the Privacy Act. They're certainly worried about the Patriot Act, which I think we need to certainly look at and get rid of. They're worried about the 9/11 recommendations, which certainly, if you use the adage that we might turn ourselves into a police state with the national ID card, with the national databases, and with the other things that are in there, certainly more agents for our border is probably a good thing, but we certainly need to look at some of that stuff and make changes. So I appreciate your vote come November, and hope to make the right choices. Thank you.
All right, and that concludes our evening for our candidates forum. Again, I'd like to thank the candidates for coming here tonight on behalf of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Reservation. And thank you very much for your participation. Thank you again to Ms. Ruth Kwikwasu, to our panelists, to Dr. Frank Tyro for actually filming this, and thank you again for being here. Good night.
Thank you.
Very much. Nice to meet you. Thank you, Tracy. Nice job. Thank you.